Kalemore was the first to notice. He was a hunter, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, with fingers calloused from years of gripping flint spears, and he had learned to read the sky the way others read animal tracks. On the night the seventh moon rose and did not set, Kalemore knew something ancient and wrong had arrived. He stood at the edge of the Zarata River, the fire behind him crackling low, the settlement of 300 souls sleeping in hide-covered shelters at his back. His sister, Davisorn, crouched beside him. She was younger by 2 seasons but sharper in every way that mattered. Her mind moved like falcon wings, quick and silent and deadly precise. "It is not a star," she said. "No," Kalemore agreed. "And it is not falling. No. It is landing." The object, enormous, dark, shaped like a flattened shell of some impossible sea creature, descended without sound over the eastern ridge. The ground did not shake. The air did not burn. It simply arrived, the way a predator arrives when it does not need to announce itself. That silence was the most terrifying thing Kalemore had ever experienced. By morning the elders had gathered. The spiritual leader, old Rethanuma, a woman of 70 seasons whose white hair hung like river reeds, held her carved bone staff and stared toward the ridge. She had seen many things. She had survived drought, plague, the great bear of the northern valley. But her hands trembled now. "We leave," said Gorutak, the settlement's strongest warrior. He was enormous even by the standards of the era, nearly 6 feet tall, his arms thick as river wood. "We take the children and we run south." "And if it follows?" Davisorn asked. Silence. It was Kalemore who walked toward the ridge. Not because he was brave, he was terrified, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain every predator in the valley could hear it. He walked because he was curious. That specific human madness, the need to know even when knowing might kill you. He climbed the eastern ridge alone as the sun rose. At the top he lay flat in the dry grass and looked down. They were not like anything he had language for. There were perhaps 40 of them. They stood upright, that was the first shock, on 2 legs like humans. But the similarity ended there. Their bodies were encased in something dark and segmented, like the shell of a river beetle but massive, fitted, seemingly alive. Their heads were wide and flat, like hammerhead fish stretched tall, with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern, 2 forward, 2 wide. They moved with a kind of deliberate, mechanical grace that reminded Kalemore of the mantis insects that hunted in the reeds. They were setting up structures. Pillars of dark material that hummed when erected. They were scanning the land with tools Kalemore had no name for, instruments that swept beams of pale light across the soil, the rock, the river. They were studying. Kalemore watched for 2 hours. They did not speak, or if they did, it was in frequencies he could not hear. They communicated through rapid movements of their upper appendages, a silent sign language of impossible complexity. He counted their weapons. Long rods carried at the hip. What appeared to be clawed gauntlets on their primary hands. 2 of the larger ones carried something that looked like a compressed storm, crackling, contained, barely held. Kalemore crawled back down the ridge. When he returned to the settlement, everyone was waiting. He sat by the fire and told them everything he had seen. He left nothing out, not even his fear. When he was finished, Rethanuma spoke. "In the old stories," she said, "the Skywalkers came twice before. Once in fire, and the world shook for a generation. Once in silence, and the people who met them were never found again." "What did those people do wrong?" Davisorn asked. Rethanuma looked at her for a long moment. "They waited," the old woman said. It was Davisorn who had the first idea. She was always the one with ideas, the one who had figured out how to cure the river sickness with boiled bark, who had engineered the irrigation channel that saved 2 harvests, who at 15 had invented a new kind of spear tip that could penetrate thick hide at twice the previous distance. Her idea was simple and, by the standards of the era, completely insane. "We communicate first," she said, "before they decide what we are." "They are gods," Gorutak said. "They are not gods," Davisorn replied calmly. "Gods do not need to study the soil. Gods already know what is in it." That single sentence shifted something in the room. Kalemore looked at his sister and felt that old familiar feeling, the one he always felt when she spoke, that the future was slightly more survivable than it had been a moment before. "How?" he asked. "Fire," she said. "Geometry. Pattern." She picked up a stick and drew in the dirt, a triangle, a circle, a sequence of lines representing prime numbers, though she had no word for what a prime number was. She had simply noticed years ago that certain numbers could not be divided, and that this property seemed universal, stitched into the behavior of everything from ripples in water to the growth of shells. "Things that are true in any world," she said. We show them we know truth. Then they cannot decide we are animals. That night, on the eastern ridge, Davison lit the largest fire their settlement had ever built. Around it, in precise arrangements, she placed smaller fires, patterns that spoke in the universal grammar of mathematics. Far below, in the dark hollow where the alien vessel rested, 4 diamond-pattern eyes turned toward the ridge. Something changed in the posture of the creatures. Calemore stood beside his sister, gripping his spear though he knew it would be useless, and watched the aliens watch them. "Are they angry?" he whispered. Davison studied their silhouettes against the vessel's pale glow. "No," she said slowly. "I think they are surprised." In the valley below, the largest of the creatures, the one that moved with authority, the one the others deferred to, raised one segmented arm and made a gesture toward the ridge. The gesture was unmistakable. "Come down." Calemore exhaled. "That is either an invitation or a trap." "Yes," his sister agreed. She picked up a torch. She started walking down. 2 years had passed since Davison walked down the ridge. The world had not ended. That was the first surprise. The second surprise was how much the aliens feared humans, and how long it took both sides to realize it. The creatures called themselves the Vrethaki, though this was not a name so much as a designation, a frequency pattern that Davison spent 8 months learning to replicate by striking clay vessels in specific rhythmic sequences. The Vrethaki communicated in sound, but not in the ranges human ears easily processed. Their language existed at the edges, deep subsonic pulses for formal communication, higher crackling tones for emotional registers. Davison learned it. Not completely. Not perfectly. But enough. Enough to understand that the Vrethaki had been here before. Many cycles passed, she translated for Calemore one cold evening, sitting near the alien vessel's outer hull where a warmth radiated that smelled of lightning. Their records say, this world was surveyed. Mapped. Categorized. And what were humans categorized as? Calemore asked. Davison was quiet for a moment. Promising fauna, she said. Calemore stared at her. Fauna? He repeated. Animals, she confirmed. Intelligent animals, their records noted, tool use, social bonding, basic symbolic communication. But not, she paused, searching for the word, not persons. Not what they recognize as persons. And now? She looked toward the ridge where the alien leader, she had named it Veth, the closest human approximation of its designation, stood motionless in the early darkness, its 4 eyes scanning the stars with what Davison had come to recognize as something like melancholy. Now they are not certain, she said. The Vrethaki had come to Earth for the same reason they had come every 30,000 years, resource extraction. Deep beneath the fertile plains, there were mineral seams of enormous value to their civilization. They had extracted from this world before, in the time before human memory, and they saw no reason this visit would be different. They had not expected the fires on the ridge. They had not expected a creature to walk toward them alone, holding light, drawing mathematical patterns. Veth had been a scholar before becoming an expedition commander, a student of what the Vrethaki called emergence patterns, the rare occasions when fauna on surveyed worlds developed unexpected complexity. It had documented 3 such events in its long career. Never had emergence reached this stage so quickly. The Vrethaki lifespan was enormous. Veth was 3,000 years old by human counting. From that perspective, 30,000 years between surveys was not long. But in 30,000 years, the promising fauna of this world had built settlements, developed agriculture, created art, and invented mathematics. The rate of development was, by Vrethaki standards, baffling. Why so fast? Veth asked Davison one morning, in their halting cross-species communication. Davison considered the question seriously, as she always did. We die quickly, she said at last. Veth's 4 eyes focused on her with an intensity she had learned to recognize as deep interest. Explain, it pulsed. We live perhaps 40 or 50 seasons if we are fortunate, 20 if we are not. Every generation must rediscover, but also, every generation must improve. We cannot rely on memory. We must create tools, systems, things that outlast us. We have no time for slow. She paused. Death makes us efficient. Veth was silent for a very long time. We live thousands of seasons, it said finally. We assumed longevity was advantage. It is, Davison said. But it is also a slowness. You have time to wait. We do not. This was the beginning of what Veth would later record in its expedition logs as the first recognition event. The moment when the Vrethaki began to genuinely reconsider the status of the creatures on this blue world. But recognition did not mean safety. There were 40 Vrethaki on the expedition. Veth was the scholar, the communicator. But Commander Drathvek, second in authority responsible for the extraction mission, was not a scholar. It was an engineer. A pragmatist. And it had a schedule. Kalemore noticed Drathvek the way he noticed dangerous animals, by the specific quality of its stillness. It never joined Veth's conversations with Davisorn. It stood at the edge of the vessel and watched the human settlement with a quality of attention that Kalemore could only describe as calculation. One night, he caught Davisorn before she went to sleep. The second one, he said. The engineer. Drathvek, she nodded. It is planning something. Davisorn was quiet. Yes. You have known. Yes. He sat across from her and looked into the fire. The extraction. The minerals. Our settlement is built over the richest seam. Davisorn nodded slowly. Veth would negotiate. Veth would find another way. She paused. But Drathvek has more authority over the mission itself. And Drathvek has not reclassified us yet. Still fauna, Kalemore said. Still fauna. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do we do? Davisorn looked up at the sky, at the strange knot star that was the Vrethaki vessel's top structure, visible over the ridge. We stop being animals, she said. She reached into her pack and pulled out a clay tablet. On it, over the past months, she had been recording everything she had learned about the Vrethaki. Their technology, their biology, their patterns, their weaknesses. Because everything had weaknesses, she had learned this from the river, from animals, from weather. Nothing was unbeatable. Nothing. The extraction machines, she said, tracing a diagram on the clay. They operate on a subsonic frequency to loosen mineral bonds. The same frequency, she tapped a specific marking, causes cascade failure in their shell suits if sustained for more than 40 heartbeats. Kalemore stared at her. How do you know this? Because Veth told me without realizing it, during a lesson on Vrethaki material science. She met his eyes. I have been paying attention for 2 years. She had more. Schematics of the vessel's external power coupling, exposed during maintenance, vulnerable to specific disruption. Maps of the crew's patrol patterns. Notes on the 3 Vrethaki who appeared to be developing what she could only describe as sympathy for humanity, who might, in the right moment, choose differently than their mission demanded. Kalemore looked at his sister for a long moment. You have been preparing for this since the beginning, he said. Since I walked down the ridge, she agreed. Hoping for peace, he said. Planning for war, she replied. The fire popped. Stars wheeled overhead. Somewhere over the ridge, Drathvek stood in the dark and calculated. Davisorn rolled up the clay diagram and tucked it back into her pack. We have perhaps 10 days, she said. The extraction machines will be ready in 10 days. And if Veth cannot stop Drathvek? She looked at him with the same expression she had worn at 15, when she had held up the new spear tip and showed him how it worked. That mixture of certainty and grief that comes from knowing you are right about something terrible. Then we teach the Vrethaki something new about promising fauna, she said. On the 8th day before the extraction was scheduled to begin, Drathvek made its first move. It was subtle. Elegant, even, the kind of move that a 3,000-year-old civilization makes when it wants to remove an obstacle without officially recognizing that the obstacle was ever a problem. The Vrethaki simply began expanding their perimeter. Not with weapons. Not with threats. With infrastructure. The extraction zone, the area that would be scarred, stripped, and rendered lifeless by the machines, was quietly extended. Its new boundaries now included the Zarata settlement. Not as a target. Simply as an inconvenient overlap. An overlap that, if the settlement continued to exist within it, would be regrettable. Kalemore spotted it during his morning patrol. The boundary markers, humming pillars of dark material, had moved 300 meters overnight. He stood at the new boundary and looked back at the settlement, calculating distances. He went to Gortak first. The big warrior stood outside his shelter, sharpening an axe head with methodical strokes, and listened without expression as Kalemore explained. When Kalemore finished, Gortak set down the axe. How many can we arm? He asked. We have 60 fighters. Real fighters, trained, experienced. Another 40 who can hold a weapon adequately. Against 40 Vrethaki with storm weapons and shell suits. Against 40 Vrethaki, Kalemore confirmed. Gortak picked up his axe and resumed sharpening. Tell me everything your sister found. Meanwhile, Davisorn was having the most important conversation of her life. She had gone to the vessel before dawn, and Veth had met her at the outer hatch, alone, which was unusual. Its posture communicated something she had learned to read as urgency. Drathvek has refiled the extraction perimeter, Veth said in their cross-species shorthand. I know, she said. Kalemore spotted it this morning. I am opposed. I have formally registered opposition. What does opposition accomplish? Veth's 4 eyes moved in a pattern she had come to associate with discomfort. In Mission Protocol, Limited, the Science Division recommends. The Engineering Division decides. And Drathvek is engineering. Yes. Davisorn was quiet for a moment. Then, can you delay? Perhaps 6 days. By requiring additional survey documentation. I need 10. I do not have 10. Then 6, she said. 6 days is enough if we use them correctly. She told Veth what she knew, about the cascade frequency, about the power coupling, about the sympathy faction within the crew. She laid it out cleanly, without emotion, the way she presented every problem, as a system to be understood, with inputs and outputs and pressure points. Veth listened. Its shell suit flickered in patterns she had never seen before. You have been analyzing us, it said when she finished. Yes. For how long? Since the first night. Another long silence. You are not what the old records described. The old records were from 30,000 years ago, she said. We have had 30,000 years. Veth made a low pulse she had learned meant agreement tinged with something like regret. If I help you, it said, I violate mission protocol. Yes. My career ends. Perhaps my freedom. Yes. And if I do not help you, your people die. Yes, Davisorn said simply. Or fight. And if we fight, some of your people die too. Which matters to you, I think. The observation landed precisely where she intended. The 3 Vrethakai she had identified as sympathy candidates, she had named them Sura, Kelith, and Morn, after sounds she associated with each of their communication patterns, were all young by Vrethakai standards. A mere 5 or 6 centuries old. They had never conducted an extraction mission before. They had been asking questions, Veth had told her once, that older crew members found uncomfortable. Questions about the fauna. Questions about the fires on the ridge. Questions about whether the records were accurate. Young in any species meant not yet certain that the rules were immutable. I cannot stop the extraction, Veth said finally. But I can give you time. And I can look elsewhere when certain things happen. That is enough, Davisorn said. Back in the settlement, Kalemore organized the defense. He was, by any measure, a remarkable military mind, though he would not have used that phrase having no concept of military science as a discipline. He simply understood predators. And he understood terrain. And he understood that 40 Vrethakai with superior technology could nonetheless be defeated if they were confused, separated, and struck at precisely the right moments. The plan had 5 components. The first was sound. Davisorn had spent 2 years learning to replicate Vrethakai subsonic frequencies. She had assembled an instrument, a precisely tuned array of clay vessels, stretched membranes and resonance chambers, that could produce the cascade frequency. It would not work through shell suits at full power. But shell suits consumed energy. And energy had to come from somewhere. The second component was the power coupling. If the vessel's external coupling was disrupted, not destroyed, just briefly interrupted, the shell suits would cycle to reserve power. Reserve power meant reduced capacity. Reduced capacity meant the cascade frequency became viable. The third component was separation. The Vrethakai operated in cohesive units of 4. Separate the units, and they lost the communication redundancy that made their tactical decision-making so fast. Kalemore's best runners, young, light, intimate with every fold of this landscape, would be responsible for this. Not combat. Pure chaos. Disruption. Make the terrain unpredictable. The fourth component was the 3 young ones, Sura, Kelith, Morn. Davisorn had no guarantee they would act. But she had spent weeks in subtle conversation, planting seeds. Showing them things about the settlement. The children learning to count stones, the elder Rethanuma's evening story hour, the way the people organized themselves around complex social obligations. Things that were difficult to look at and still think. Fauna. The fifth component was Kalemore himself. He would go after Drathvek. Not to kill, he was not certain killing was even possible. But to occupy. To face the commander directly and keep its attention fixed while everything else unfolded around it. It was the role he had assigned himself, not because it was tactically optimal, but because he could not, in good conscience, assign it to anyone else. On the 5th day before extraction, Kalemore stood in the center of the settlement as the sun went down and looked at the 300 faces watching him. Old Rethanuma with her bone staff. Gorutak axe on his shoulder. The children in the doorways. 60 fighters in their positions, painted for movement in the dark. And his sister, standing at the edge of the group, her clay resonance array slung across her back, her expression carrying that terrible mixture of certainty and grief. He raised his hand. "We have never been fauna," he said. The settlement was very quiet. "Tomorrow night," he said, "we prove it." The night was clear. That mattered. In cloud cover, the Vrethakai's wide-spectrum vision gave them a crushing advantage in the dark. Under open stars, with their 4 eyes adjusted for long-range scanning, they were actually slightly worse at close-range processing of moving targets in complex terrain. Davisorn had noted this during her observations and filed it under factors that favor us. It was a short list, but she had built their entire strategy around it. At midnight, Kalemore gave the signal. 3 of his youngest and fastest runners, Pel, Sava, and Irix, none older than 16 seasons, sprinted for the vessel's maintenance side. They had drilled this for 4 nights. 28 steps from the trilene to the external power coupling. 3 heartbeats to apply the clay and mineral paste Davisorn had compounded, which would disrupt the coupling's conductance long enough for the shell suits to cycle. 4 heartbeats to clear the blast zone if the coupling rejected the paste with a discharge. Pel went first. Sava second. Irix as backup. Pel reached the coupling, applied the paste, and ran. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the vessel's outer lights dimmed. Across the ridge, 40 shell suits flickered. Davisorn began to play. The resonance array produced a sound that was not quite sound, it was felt more than heard, a vibration in the teeth and chest, a pressure behind the eyes. Kalemore had tested it on himself during preparation and described the sensation as being inside a drum. At the frequency Davisorn had calibrated it to, and with shell suits running on reserve power, the effect on Vrethakai physiology was disorientation, vision blur, and loss of coordinated movement after approximately 35 heartbeats. She began counting the moment the suits flickered. On the ridge, the Vrethakai patrol units began to lose coherence. 2 of them stumbled. 1 dropped its rod weapon. The communication between units, normally a seamless rapid-fire exchange of subsonic pulses, began to fragment. To Kalemore's runners, moving through the terrain like water through cracks, this looked like exactly what it was. Predators who had never been confused before, now confused. The runners did their work. Not fighting. Dancing. Appearing at the edge of firelight, drawing attention, vanishing into terrain the Vrethakai had not bothered to fully map. Human bodies in familiar landscape, that specific advantage, the one no amount of superior technology could substitute for. Gorutak led 12 fighters to the extraction staging area, the machines themselves. The goal was not destruction. Davisorn had been specific. Destroying Vrethakai property would trigger a response they could not survive. The goal was delay. The machines used organic bonding agents in their joint assemblies, substances that, when introduced to a specific mineral compound found in river clay, broke down within hours. The fighters carried pouches of river clay compound. They applied it, silently, to every joint they could reach. At 40 heartbeats, Davisorn stopped playing and waited. The shell suits recovered. The Vrethakai began to reorganize. Drathvek's pulse commands cut through the confusion like a blade, sharp and authoritative, re-establishing unit cohesion. It was faster than Davisorn had estimated. Her models had given them 60 heartbeats. They had 43. "Now," she said to no one in particular. On the far side of the ridge, in the area Drathvek was pulling units away from to consolidate toward the staging area, 3 Vrethakai did something unprecedented in Vrethakai expedition history. They did not follow orders. Sura, Kelith, and Morn, the young ones, the questioners, had been assigned to sweep the eastern boundary. Instead, they moved to the vessel entrance and sealed it from outside, cutting off Drathvek's access to the primary weapon system stored inside. It was a small action. By itself it changed nothing. But it forced Drathvek to redirect 3 units to deal with the defectors, and in that redirection the commander's absolute attention, the thing keeping the disorganized response from becoming catastrophic, split. That was when Kalemore walked out of the dark. He walked into the open ground between the vessel and the ridge, into the starlight, alone and visible, carrying nothing but a flint spear and the expression of a man who has made his peace with fear and found it acceptable company. Drathvek's 4 eyes locked onto him. Kalemore held its gaze. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He simply stood there, a single human being, alone, unarmored, in the open, and refused to move. refused to run, refused to perform the role of prey. Something in Drathvek's response changed. Kael'mor could feel it, a shift in the quality of the commander's attention, from tactical calculation to something harder to name. Later, Davisorn would tell him that in Vrethakai behavioral science, there was a concept for encountering a prey species that did not behave like prey. It was called classification rupture, and it was, by Vrethakai standards, deeply disturbing. Not frightening in the way danger was frightening. Disturbing in a more fundamental way. A crack in the model of the world. Drathvek stood still. Kael'mor stood still. Around them, the valley was full of chaos, runners and shadows and disoriented patrols and the quiet sabotage of machines, and for 40 heartbeats, the two of them occupied a separate pocket of time, a standoff that neither side had language for. Then Drathvek raised its storm weapon. Kael'mor did not flinch. He had decided before coming here, that flinching was the one thing he could not do. Not because it would get him killed, it probably would, but because if he flinched, the commander's model of the world would repair itself. The crack would close. He would be Fauna again and everything that followed would be Fauna's fate. He stared into the weapon's aperture. And Drathvek did not fire. 3 heartbeats. 5. 10. The weapon lowered. Kael'mor exhaled very slowly, keeping his face still. In the background, the extraction machine's joints had begun to fail. 3 units were occupied with the defectors at the vessel entrance. The staging area was compromised. The commander's window for a clean extraction had closed. From the vessel, Veth emerged, carefully, formally, in what Davisorn would later describe as full scholar's posture, a specific arrangement of limbs and head position that in Vrethakai culture signaled the invocation of record-keeping authority. What Veth said to Drathvek was too complex for Kael'mor to follow. But he understood the emotional register. Not argument, not confrontation. Documentation. Veth was creating an official record in real time that could not be altered or ignored. A record of what had happened here. A record of what these creatures had done. When it was over, Drathvek looked at Kael'mor one final time. Then it turned and went back to the vessel. Kael'mor stood alone in the starlight until he was sure his legs were not going to give out. Then he sat down on the ground, put his face in his hands and breathed for a very long time. The Vrethakai left on the 3rd day after the battle. Not in defeat. Not in acknowledgement of defeat. The expedition log, as Veth later transmitted a partial translation to Davisorn, recorded the departure as mission suspended pending reclassification review of surface fauna, Category 4 designation contested, formal inquiry initiated. Category 4, Veth explained, meant, of uncertain status. Neither fauna nor person. A liminal category that, in 3,000 years of Vrethakai record-keeping, had been applied to exactly 2 other species, both of which had eventually been confirmed as persons and extended full protection under Vrethakai Galactic Convention. Reclassification review, Davisorn repeated. How long does that take? Veth's response was the closest to human humor she had ever heard from it. By our standards, perhaps 400 of your years. She stared. You will not be alive, Veth said, when the review concludes. No, she agreed. But our children's children's children will be. Veth looked at her for a long time. Yes, it said at last. That appears to be how you work. They stood at the vessel entrance for the last time. The extraction machines had been disabled. The joint compound had done its work efficiently, and the cost of repair exceeded the value of continuing the mission, given the complications. The staging area was empty. The boundary markers had been removed. The 3 defectors, Sura, Kelith, Morn, were inside. Their fate within Vrethakai society was uncertain. Drathvek had not moved against them during the standoff, and the official record Veth had created made any later action politically complex. But uncertain was not safe. Tell Sura, Davisorn said, that what it did was, she searched for a word. Tell it the word we use for when someone risks everything for what is right without certainty of outcome. Veth waited. Courage, she said. Veth made the deep subsonic pulse she had come to associate with something like emotion, something that in humans might have been grief and gratitude together. I will tell it, Veth said. Then the vessel closed and the sky turned and they were gone. What happened in the years that followed was not a story of triumph. It was more complicated and more interesting than that. Kael'mor lived to be 53 seasons old, remarkable for the era. He never spoke much about the night on the ridge. When young warriors asked him how he had stood still in front of a weapon that could unmake him, he would say, I was more afraid of what I would become if I ran. He spent his later years teaching. Not hunting technique or weapon craft, though he could teach those. He taught the thing Davisorn had shown him was the most important human skill: observation. How to look at a thing, anything, and ask what it actually was rather than what you already believed it to be. He died in the summer, surrounded by people he had trained, watching his sister demonstrate a new method of water channeling to a group of children who looked up at her with the expression Kalemore had worn his entire life. Awe, and the particular safety of knowing you are in the presence of someone who is thinking faster than you and taking you seriously anyway. He was content. Davisorn lived to be 61, which was essentially unprecedented. She spent her last 3 decades doing what she had always done: looking at the world and asking questions. She developed better agricultural methods, new construction techniques, a system of symbolic notation that was not quite writing but pointed toward it, a set of consistent marks that could convey specific information across time and distance. She never stopped thinking about the Vrethaki. Not with fear. With curiosity, the same curiosity that had made her walk down the ridge alone at 22 years old. She filled clay tablets with everything she remembered, everything she had learned about them, and she arranged for those tablets to be protected, stored, passed down. Most of them did not survive. Some did. Archaeologists digging in the Zarata River region, which humans would rename multiple times over 10,000 years, eventually calling it something with the root word for between the rivers, found fragments in the late 20th century. Strange markings that didn't fit any known symbolic system. Patterns that some researchers noted, in puzzled academic papers, appeared to contain mathematical sequences far more complex than the period should have produced. One researcher, a woman named Dr. Sarah Okafor, spent 4 years on the tablets and published a paper arguing that the sequences were not random, not decorative, and not religious, that they appeared to be records of technical observations made by someone with sophisticated scientific methodology, in approximately 10,000 BC. Her paper was politely dismissed. She kept the clay tablet fragments on her desk anyway. 400 years after Davisorn died, in a Vrethaki administrative chamber on the far side of the galaxy, a committee reviewed the contested Category 4 designation for the fauna of a blue world in an unremarkable solar system. The record Veth had created was presented. The testimony of Sura, Kelith, and Morn, who had lived long enough to give it, though the political consequences had been significant, was entered into evidence. The committee deliberated for 6 months. The verdict was unanimous: Category I. Full persons. Protected status under Galactic Convention. No extraction, no interference, no contact without consent. Earth did not know this had happened. Earth was busy with its own complicated, beautiful, terrible history, wars and harvests and languages and mathematics and music and all the rest of it, the full cacophony of a species in furious motion toward something it couldn't yet name. But somewhere in an administrative archive, in a language no human being had yet learned to read, was a record that said, "These creatures stood alone in the dark and did not flinch. They are not fauna. They are persons. Leave them to become what they are becoming." In the Zarata Valley the river still ran. The ridge was still there, worn lower by 10,000 years of wind and rain, but still the same ridge. The view from the top had changed enormously. Now there were roads and cities and lights at night, and aircraft moving through the sky on routes that would have meant nothing to Kalemore and everything to Davisorn. The ground still held the mineral seams the Vrethaki had come for. They had never been extracted. Below the surface, untouched, exactly where they had always been, a quiet reminder of what had almost happened and what had not and why. Somewhere above, in frequencies no human instrument had yet learned to detect, a monitoring signal maintained a gentle watch, the Vrethaki version of a note in the margin of history, added after the reclassification. Watch them. Not to interfere. Just to watch. They are worth watching.